This is the first of two videos, this video looking at lines 173 to 214. Today we're looking at the poem's next section, the Fire Sermon. As with my previous videos, we'll start with a look at the title, but let's look at our title so far. In the burial of the dead, we had our earth symbol, and in the context of spring, what should have been a life symbol, especially in spring, ironically became a symbol for death. Irony is a consistent theme in the wasteland. In the game of chess, there was a kind of retreat from nature into the city. In Eliot's time, the city was seen as a hallmark of civilization and progress, with inventions like electricity, the typewriter, the telephone, the automobile, indoor plumbing, modern sanitation, skyscrapers, etc. Not that all these are unique to the city. Yet even here, or especially here, utility and death, these age-old themes, both symbolized by wind, still had a presence and served to undermine all this accomplishment. Again, irony. In the Fire Sermon, we have another elemental. Like all elementals, fire is ambivalent. We can think of fire as good, like with Prometheus or Dante's Purgatorio, or bad, like in the Christian Hell. The Wasteland, being a religious or spiritual poem, and having ancient fertility rituals as background, not to mention how fire is manifested so far in the poem, has us look negatively at this elemental. Remember, in ancient fertility rituals, water was a life symbol, to be contrasted with fire and its negative manifestations in nature, drought and infertility. Now, infertility is more natural or nature-based. It's bad, but it's not unnatural. In section 2, we have sterility introduced into the poem, yet it's not as potent there as it will be in section 3. In section 2, there's an interplay between fire and sterility. For example, in lines 87 to 88, we had perfumes and liquid, and in 89 to 91, odors fattening the prolonged candle flames. For the former, perfume doesn't seem so bad at first, but contrasting it to Antony Cleopatra's water scene, emphasis on water, the liquid is a sterile product. As a kid, I remember overhearing a story about how a classmate used cologne as an impromptu antiseptic for a cut. Quick thinking on his part. Still, cologne or perfume works because it's literally a sterilizing product. It's a poor, or in keeping with irony, seemingly rich, yet actually poor, and sterilizing substitute for water. The odors of this water substitute fatten the flames in line 91. So there's a relationship between this artificialness and our elemental for section 3. Going further, perfume is connected with fire because perfume hides desire. Carry this idea and its interplay to lines 99 to 100. If you watched my previous video, Teres is described by Ovid in such words as inflamed, mad passion, and the fire that burned. It's not love proper that he feels for Philomela. This flame of his leads him to commit a terrible act on Philomela. Here the interplay is reversed because we go from desire to sterility. No love, no reproduction results from their union. Even Philomela's rebirth is tainted by her bird song, or never fully escapes what caused the rebirth in the first place. See lines 203 to 206. Finally, there are those abortions in line 159 to 160. It's not quite sterility since Lil can still reproduce or keeps reproducing. More on this in a moment. Yet she's effectively or ultimately keeping life from being or continuing. Here again, there's still an interplay between sterility and fire. Fire is desire, brought about Lil and her partner's union, yet the consequences of this union are ended or sterilized. Also, the abortions aren't limited to themselves. Notice the poem nearly died in line 160. In a sense, her abortions are sterilizing her, as in her life, or at least her life-giving ability. In contrast with infertility, sterility is more modern, more unnatural. Like most things, it's twofold. On the one hand, sterility is good, such as with food prep and surgical instruments. On the other hand, it's awful, such as, for example, in unlawful sterilizations of indigenous peoples in the 20th century. If one keeps in mind the mass genocides of that same century, one could argue that genocide is a form of sterilization too. Octavio Paz has this quote, "The century of health, hygiene, and contraceptives, miracle drugs, and synthetic foods is also the century of the concentration camp and the police state, Hiroshima, and the murder story." The ancient relationship of healing, just as the ancient relationship of hurting, changed in the 20th century. Previously, it was a personal act to heal, the same with to hurt. It was difficult to do either at a distance and in mass. There are exceptions for the latter, of course, the catapult or the cannon, but modern death, or modern mass death, is a deep personalized act, like sterilization. Whether for positive or negative, sterility is a part of modern life, modern city life. Eliot will, of course, focus on its negative side. In my previous videos, I mentioned how ancient peoples made deep connections between the reproductive functions of the natural world to those of their own bodies. They commonly believed that the tie between the animal and vegetable world was even closer than it really is, so then the principle of life and fertility whether animal or vegetable, was one and indivisible. Hence, actions that induce fertility in the animal world were held to be equally efficacious, stimulating the reproductive energies of the vegetable. How deeply this idea was rooted in the minds of our ancestors, we, the descendants, may learn from its survival to our own day. From these actions, there came to be symbols of these actions, such as water in general, or union of lance and vessel. From this aforementioned principle of life and fertility, one and indivisible, we go to the state of things in the land, the vegetable, animal, and human worlds. If the land is in waste, the pollution source requires human agency to correct. It also requires some beyond human agency to correct, but more on this later. The same is true of civilization in Eliot's poem. Except from infertility, a qualitative leap has been made to sterility. Returning to the elemental of this section, fire is an appropriate image for sterilization. It's the more inherently destructive of the four elements. Yet Eliot will not use fire in a secular way, yet also not in some holier-than-thou, Bible-thumper way, that we might easily expect, although there is a sermon, yet not a Christian one. The title of the fire sermon is a reference to a sermon of the same title by the Buddha on passion, sometimes better translated as desire, or yearning, or craving. Let's start by looking at some of the texts Eliot referenced. And there the Blessed One addressed the priests. All things, O priests, are on fire. And what, O priests, are all these things which are on fire? The eye, O priest, is on fire. Forms are on fire. Eye consciousness is on fire. Impressions received by the eye are on fire. And whatever sensation, pleasant, unpleasant, or indifferent, originates independence on impressions received by the eye, that also is on fire. And with what are these things on fire? With the fire of passion, say I, with the fire of hatred, with the fire of infatuation, with birth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, misery, grief, and despair are they on fire. And whatever sensation, pleasant, unpleasant, or indifferent, originates in dependence on impressions received by the mind, that also is on fire. And whatever sensation, pleasant, unpleasant, indifferent, originates in dependence on impressions received by the mind, for this also he conceives an inversion. And in concerning this inversion, he becomes divested of passion, and by the absence of passion he becomes free. And when he is free, he becomes aware that he is free, and he knows that the rebirth is exhausted, that he has lived the holy life, and that he has done what is behooved him to do, and that he is no more for this world. Now while this exposition was being delivered, the minds of the 1,000 priests became free from attachment, and delivered from the depravities. If we know nothing else about Buddhism, almost all of us know its central tenet, namely desire being the root of all suffering. How is this related to the poem? There are about a dozen, what could we call them, vignettes, in which passion, by which I largely mean lust, which again can also be understood as desire, passion, or yearning, is the problem at this section's center. Lust has always been a human problem, and it's not as if people are any more lustful today than they were in the Buddha's time. Yet for Eliot, I believe it's more that this human expression has never been, one, so unchecked as it is in the 20th century, and there's a reason for this to be touched on later, hence the Buddha and later Augustine references, but also more importantly too, all this in the background of ancient fertility rituals. In the wasteland, the rituals, or more precisely the lance and cup, are still there. There's no way they can't not be, as embedded in the psyche as they are believed to be. However, they are now not only grossly ironic, but sterile-producing too. As for the rituals, it would be more accurate to say that they have been divested of their religiousness, or magic. One final thing. Section 3 is the poem's midpoint. In my previous video I mentioned how the natural world and the human world are the dominant forces in all the poem's sections. Yet in some sections, one force is more dominant than the other. For example, Section 2 only touches on the human world. Section 4 will seemingly be exclusive to the natural world. As the midpoint, Section 3 will present the most heightened interactions between the natural world and the human world. And as Section 3 presents the midpoint of all sections, later keep in mind the midpoint's midpoint, or the poem's, in terms of lines, general midpoint. Also, we've made it far enough into the wasteland that we can keep track of what Sultan calls the poem's 3s and 4s, that is, recurring leitmotifs. As with other videos, connections will be in brackets after the poem's lines. Lines 173 to 184. The river tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. Sweet Thames runs softly to end my song. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed, and their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors, departed and have left no addresses. By the waters of Leman, I sat down and wept. Sweet Thames, run softly to end my song. Sweet Thames, run softly, for I speak not loud or long, but on my back in the cold blast I hear the rattle of the bones, and chuckles spread from ear to ear. At the end of section 2, the poem left off in a city pod. For better, for worse, and worse, there was people, human activity, life. Now we are back in nature. Apparently a river tent is an underwater phenomenon. As a student explained to me, when a river current runs over an underwater portraying rock, the current creates a kind of tent over the rock. Here the tent is broken, meaning that there is no river current, no motion. What happens when a river current stops? Stagnation. The source of life has been polluted. Our polluted waters match with decaying plant life. The leaf clutches like an autumn leaf because it is cut off from what gives it life, the tree, and the leaf clutches like an arthritic hand. The wind is unheard because there is no life to hear it, and the land is brown because it is in decay, like an autumn. A nymph is an English water spirit, like a fairy. It dances around sources of life like rivers and forests. Naturally, if there is no source of life, or if a life source has grown stagnant, the nymphs will depart. The nymph has two pertinent connections. The first I'll mention only in passing. According to Western's research, nymphs, along with satyrs, remember the satyr for later, have been typically regarded as fertility demons, i.e. fertility spirits. Thus the nymph's departure is in effect, and for the cause of sterility. Second, the nymph is connected to the next line, Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. Thames, of course, is a famous river in England. In the poem, it's the first of many references in this section to European topographies. For those who read the poem autobiographically, section 3 is the most interesting. However, in his The Frontiers of Criticism essay, Eliot spent some time derailing the autobiographical or psychoanalytic interpretations, how they aren't that helpful for understanding the poem as a poem, process I'm attempting here, so also not focus on Eliot the person in these The Wasteland videos. Also, I am and we are a bit removed in distance and time from these topographies, so there are others who can better comment on these locations, if or how they are still around. But there is something else I'll say about these locations that is related to my Four Elements interpretation of this poem. If we notice most locations in section 3, Thames, Lehman, Cannon Street Hotel, Queen Victoria Street, Lower Thames Street, Magnus Martyr, Greenwich, the Strand, the Isle of Dogs, Kew, Moorgate, Margate Sands, are at or near bodies of water. More importantly, these are social gatherings at or near bodies of water. With the Four Elements interpretation in mind, what should these sites remind us of, given our animal natures? Watering holes. In nature, animals flock to watering holes, and in line with our animal natures, this is true of us too. Except in the wasteland, most of our modern watering holes are polluted because of us. We have to take care to not interpret this pollution literally. Yes, there's a relation between human actions and nature's actions, but Eliot is not an environmentalist or an ecologist in the poem. Furthermore, water has a spiritual meaning, covered in my first video. This is why the solution to problems in the wasteland isn't water itself, any more than it was for ancient peoples. Ancient peoples across cultures perform rituals, the belief in or need for such rituals still embedded in our psyches, and performed today according to Weston to restore the Fisher King, whose health was connected to the land's health. The aforementioned human agency is the fertility rites. These ancient peoples' rituals and prayers weren't strictly for water, but also for health or life, which water and the healed Fisher King symbolized. Thus the solution is healing a connection, or restoring/revitalizing an authority in a religious or spiritual, or if you prefer, psychological sense. Another danger in interpreting pollution or water too literally is connected with the irony of most water sources in section 3 already being polluted in some form or another, but I'll discuss this more in sections 4 and 5. In any event, for Eliot, we are spiritually polluted, so too is our world, or a symbol for the spiritual in the world, in this case, water. Back to the nymphs. The nymphs appear in the poem this line is drawn from, Edmund Spenser's Prothallanion, a wedding poem. There in the meadow by the river's side, a flock of nymphs I chanced to espy, all lovely daughters of the flood thereby, with goodly greenish locks, all loose untied, as each had been a bride, and each one had a little wicker basket, made of fine twigs, entrailed curiously, in which they gathered flowers to fill their basket, and with fine fingers, cropped full, peaciously, with tender stalks on high. Every sort which in the meadow grew, they gathered some, the violet, palette blue, the little daisy that at the evening closes, the virgin lily, and the primrose true, with store of vermeil roses, to deck their bridegroom's poses, against the bridal day, which was not long, Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. It's a short poem, but too long to quote here. There's a lot going on in this poem in connection to the wasteland in general and for the fire sermon. Spenser's poem is a song. There's a healthy relationship between nature, water, and people. The wedding should also remind us of the ancient fertility rituals, the union of male and female symbols in matrimony. And there's the theme of love, which takes us into irony. The line, Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song, in its original source is nice, maybe a bit quaint but nice. In the wasteland it's melancholic, especially if we know the source it's drawn from. The natural world this line has been translated into is a far cry from Bartholomew's natural world, rich with natural and supernatural elements, with its bank, the witches' river hymns, was painted all with variable flowers, and all the maids adored with dainty gems, fit to deck maidens' bowers, and crown their paramours against the bridal day, which is not long. Yet this is consistent with what we've seen Eliot doing, such as in section 2's beginning in contrast from what its lines are drawn from, Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Worst of all, there's no union, no rites, like marriage, to ensure fertility. So to hear the line here is like hearing Here Comes the Bride as your ringtone on your divorce attorney's phone as the soon-to-be ex-spouse enters the courtroom. In the next lines, more irony. For a poem called The Wasteland, there's no trash. The types of litter in lines 177 to 79 is what we'd expect to find in the river. So why is this the case? The clue is summer nights. Summer nights are a time of festivity or fun in the outdoors. Summer itself represents a peak in natural human energies, but there's no going out with friends or family or significant others in the wasteland, hence no trash, or testimony of good times. It's so wasted, there's no longer even trash. It's important to keep in mind, unlike poems like the Odyssey or the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Eliot's poem doesn't always take place in what we would call the objective world. Often, as is the case of modernist literature, poets describe states of consciousness. So Eliot's not describing the River Thames as having no garbage in it. Instead, it's a snapshot of someone's interior world, the state of someone's psyche, an inner source of life. An inner Thames is stagnant, and it's been this way for so long that it has no memories or testimonies or evidence of good times. Again, the nymphs are gone. The magic or supernatural is gone. Note the absence of a supernatural figure or healthy supernatural figure here for when we get to section 5. The departed might be some clever wordplay, for departed can be taken to mean dead, as in yoking, Stenson, and Malign in section 1. Here there's also a yoking between ancient and modern elements, the nymphs and loitering heirs of city directors. The nymphs have left because of stagnation. I wonder about the city directors. The expansion of city life means an expansion of city over nature. But if section 2 is any indication of city life, lines 131 to 34, there would be loitering and pointless busy work with nothing to do, so even the heirs, which is not to be taken so literally, of city directors got tired of it and left. Or if we take the departed and have left no addresses more ominously, the heirs died. Again, no sources of life, no continuation. The nymphs depart, and so do the heirs, or descendants of modern planners. Some scholars connect the lovers in Spenser's poem to the loitering heirs, thus the degradation of the former into the latter. In the next 3 lines, Layman is a reference to Eliot in Lake Geneva, near where he was hospitalized while working on the poem. Line 182 itself is an Old Testament allusion to the Israelites in exile, remembering Jerusalem. So there's a lamentation of being divorced from something holy, and there's a concern over the lamentation going over. We can connect the something holy to the Fisher King. For those who have read from much of the romance, the fish symbol isn't exclusive to Christianity or the New Testament. In the opinion of the most recent writers on the subject, the Christian fish symbolism derives directly from the Jews, on their side, having borrowed freely from the Syrian belief and practice. What may be regarded as the central point of Jewish fish symbolism is the tradition that, at the end of the world, Messias will catch the great fish, Leviathan, and divide its flesh as food among the faithful. As a foreshadowing of this messianic feast, the Jews were in the habit of eating fish upon the Sabbath. This Jewish custom appears to have been adopted by the primitive church and early Christians on their side, celebrated a sacramental fish meal. The Catacombs supply us with numerous illustrations fully described by the 2 writers referenced to. The elements of this mystic meal were fish, bread, and wine, the last being represented in the Messianic tradition. At the end of the meal, God will give to the most worthy, i.e. to King David, the cup of blessing, one of fabulous dimensions. But there's more going on with the word Leman. According to the annotated Wasteland, Leman also means illicit mistress in some early modernist plays, which Eliot was well acquainted with. Thus sexual activity, which is supposed to be about love or reproduction, has become polluted. And as sex is a source of life, so is water. Polluted sex means polluted water. The next two lines give us another allusion, this one to marvels to his coy mistress. The original line reads, "But at my back I always hear times when your chariot hurrying near." Now we have some context for why the person lamenting is conscious of going over. More importantly, notice what Eliot does to the line. In Marvel, time is more abstract and beautified, described as a winged chariot, and it makes sense for Marvel to do this in a Carpe Diem poem, in which a lover is trying to woo his lady. In Eliot, the veneer is removed from Marvel's description of time, or there's no reason for it. There's no courtship. Time's hurrying can be seen for what it really is, death, which can still be rather abstract, which is why we have bones, which makes death more concrete, not to mention sterile. The corpse in the garden lines 71 to 72 could produce some. This isn't the case for bones. For Eliot in the poem, the courtship practice is non-existent. The courtship requires keeping lust and even love in check. Earlier I mentioned lust being unchecked. It's too easy to say that in the 20th century, we went from a going out to find love culture to a going out to get laid culture, when in fact there have always been Anselmo, Rodolphe, and Lord Byron types interested in satisfying primarily themselves. And even if their pursuits were frowned upon by the culture, they weren't forbidden. We could say Eliot is critical of the degree to which such pursuits have proliferated, that at one time it was only the Anselmo and company types, and now it's more common. But by itself, this is only a quantitative change. It's nothing new, in other words. No, for Eliot, I believe it's two things. First, fertility rituals were of a religious nature, and in some cases were practiced like marriage ceremonies. These practices are very old, like archaic remnants, and ceremonially, plants and cup were unified for something healthier or higher, like rebirth or reproduction. Our religions aren't the same as those of prehistoric peoples, yet an example of our marriages looked at religiously would be the following. Marriage is not merely a physical union of bodies under the blind compulsion of instinctive desire, nor is it an abstract moral union of wills. It is the physical expression or incarnation of a spiritual union in which the sexual act has become the vehicle of a higher creative purpose. It is for this reason that marriage is regarded by the Church as a type and a sacramental participation of the central mystery of the faith, the marriage of God and man in the incarnation. Although this is Christian, the higher creative purpose here is very consistent with ancient fertility rites and their purposes. We're not looking at this poem as Christians, and this is to the poem's credit. It's much more universal this way. Instead, from the anthropological viewpoints, human marriages, ancient and modern, are only the latest versions of the fertility rituals. In the wasteland, however, there are no ceremonies, only lances, cups, and unions, leading to the poem's sterile world. Eliot isn't saying that the problem is that people don't marry nowadays, nor that the solution is marriage. Rather, marriage proper is for something higher, celebrating love, or healthier, like line 164's, "What'd you get married for if you don't want children?" And our unions have no such goals, at least in the wasteland. Second, in the absence of religious checks, like celibacy, or ceremonial unions, like marriage, their replacements, science, has naturally demystified love. John Crowe Ransom makes the point very neatly for us in his God Without Thunder. Love is the aesthetic of sex. Lust is the science. Love implies a deferring of the satisfaction of the desire. It implies even a certain asceticism and a ritual. Lust drives forward urgently and scientifically to the immediate extirpation of the desire. Our contemporary wasteland is in a large part the result of our scientific attitude, of our complete secularization. These things, i.e. the erotic nature of much advertising and newspaper illustration, reveal a society in which sexual passion has so far decayed as to no longer be a god, as for the Greeks, or a devil, as for the early Christians, but a toy, a society where the instinctive desire to propagate has been weakened. The magic of love, culturally or at large, has been lost, which explains the absence of positive supernatural figures in Eliot's poem, and the veneer's removal from the Marvel illusion, going from a poetic wooing to just death, bones, sterility. What else would sully lust if we imagine the speaker up to his coy mistress, being interested only in sex, lead to? Lines 185 to 202. A rat crept softly through the vegetation, dragging its slimy belly on the bank, while I was fishing in the dull canal, on a winter evening, round behind the gas house, musing upon the king my brother's wreck, and on the king my father's death before him, white bodies naked, and a low, damp ground, and bones cast in a little low, dry garret, rattled by the rat's foot only, year to year. But at my back from time to time I hear the sound of horns and motors, which shall bring Sweeney to Miss Porter in the spring. Oh, the moon shone bright on Miss Porter and her daughter. They washed their feet in soda water. Et vous savoir, the fall, Chantal, dans la coupole. I mentioned the rat as a traditional Western symbol of disease and death in the Section 2 video. For the word vegetation, I believe Eliot would want us to think of the fertility rituals, also called vegetation rites, in Weston's book. So if we connect our dots, the plague creeps through life. More concretely, the rat is a city animal, maybe the city animal. Maybe you could make a case for the pigeon, but not here. And the horse was on its way out. For us in our cities, the rat is our connection to nature, or the animal world, or our animal nature. But as an unhealthy symbol, it becomes ironic. There's even another layer of irony, in that this unhealthy life symbol lives, and even thrives, in the wasteland. The dragging its slimy belly is a sign that business is good for the rat. It has had its fill so much, it drags its fat belly when it crawls. I don't believe animals can get fat in nature, so Eliot might be telling us, behold the wonders modern civilization has brought to nature. One minor remark, if we notice the two banks so far, lines 74 and 188, the rat could be seen as dragging bad disease into or near into the water, a life symbol. While it was fishing in the dull canal, should remind us of the Fisher King. The fish is a rich life symbol, the canal water, a life symbol, except the canal is dull. This line reminds me a bit of Nietzsche. Alas, I cast my net into the seas and wanted to catch good fish, but I always pulled up the head of some old god. Thus the sea gave him who was hungry a stone, and they themselves may well have come from the sea. Certainly, pearls are found in them. They are that much more similar to a heart of shellfish, and instead of a soul, I have often found salted slime in them. Fishing is connected with the divine, even here. Zarathustra pulling up something divine, albeit dated. As an aside, the stone that he's pulled up is an appropriate choice since stones are symbolic of sterility, at least in the fairy tale tradition. Remember this image for Section 5. Now there's quite a bit going on in musing upon the king my brother's wreck, and on the king my father's death before him. This line is an allusion to the tempest, with the change from father to brother. Most scholars, like Brooks for example, will connect this with von Eschenbach's Parsifal. It is possible that the alteration had been made to bring the account taken from the Tempest into accord with the situation in the Percival stories. In Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, for instance, Trevezant the Hermit is the brother of the Fisher King Amfortas. He tells Parsifal, his name all men know as Amfortas, and I weep for him evermore. Your father, Punital, is of course dead. I haven't read von Eschenbach's Parsifal, but know, according to Weston, the brother theme has its antecedents in the numerous Parsifal romances. Watch here introduces the dead knight, here Gundazert, or Gondifer, which I suspect is the more correct form, brother of the king, whose death by treachery has plunged the land in misery and been the direct cause of the self-wounding of the king. It will be noted that in this case, the king is not healed either at the moment of the slaying of his brother's murderer, which would be the logical result of the données of the tale, nor at the moment of contact with the successful quester, but at the mere announcement of his approach. In any event, I'm inclined to agree with Brooks. As for line 193, you can see my explanation in my Burial of the Dead video. Its connection to the previous lines seems straightforward. The Fisher King's death leads to human deaths. The next two lines, their bones and rats, take us back to section 2. As for its meaning here, white bodies on the ground takes us eventually to bones, the progression of decay, except with no mention of organic matter being recycled to create life once again. This land of bones reminds me of the nightmarish world of Ezekiel 37, but whether Eliot specifically had Ezekiel 37 in mind, or he's drawing from the collective unconscious, is anyone's guess. And much as in earlier lines, the rat is the only survivor, and even thriver. Lines 196 to 202 are to be taken together. First, the Marvel illusion from before leads into another illusion, Days the Parliament of Bees. When of a sudden listening you shall hear the noise of horns and hunting, which shall bring Actaeon to Diana in the spring, where all shall see her naked skin. The winged chariot from Marvel has turned into a modern car, with its sound of horns and motors, and the horns and hunting from Day has turned into the sounds of horns and motors for modern day traffic. Before continuing with this scene, I'm going into a small digression. In a previous video, I previewed the modernist dictum, Ezra Pound's Make It New. Eliot was the champion of this phrase, high modernism's greatest champion. Eliot did that here with the Marvel and Day allusions, does it elsewhere also. But why make it new? First, I'll share some quotes. From time to time there occurs some revolution, or sudden mutation of a form and content in literature. Then some way of writing is found by a few people, no longer to respond to contemporary modes of thought, feeling, and speech. A new kind of writing appears. We hear that the tradition has been flouted, and that chaos has come. After a time it appears that the new way of writing is not destructive, but recreated. It is not that we have repudiated the past, but that in the light of what is new, we see the past in a new pattern. The perpetual task of poetry is to make all things new, not necessarily to make new things. Eliot insists that in poetry, the true innovator never invents. Instead, he or she forces and stretches, dislocates and distorts what has been given into something new. In Eliot's younger days, poetry was in a bad way. Poetry here means largely Georgian poetry. For a brief but detailed explanation as to how and why, I'd recommend the first two chapters of Maxwell's The Poetry of T.S. Eliot. For Eliot, poetry wasn't as bad as in the Victorian period, the Romantic era, but he still regarded Romanticism poetry as a digression from the norm, or at least a better norm. So what was wrong with poetry? Poetry had either become outdated, that is, so-called poets striking old forms and old sounds that were clearly out of place in a new century, the century of the city and the machine. Or worse, poetry had become popular, in Eliot's derogatory sense of the term, meaning it had become so watered down that anyone and everyone was writing, submitting, or easily understanding poetry. In our time, a good comparison to this would be popular science documentaries. For a true scientist, science is much more abstract, technical, laborious, and personal, yet even sometimes creative, and most times duller, in how it's portrayed in popular science documentaries. If we watch these documentaries, which are more ornamentation than science, and think this is science, or quote from them as if we are scientists. True scientists are in the trenches, or mostly in the trenches, wrestling with problems, and Eliot would feel that this is the same with poets, wrestling with language, not necessarily coming up with rhymes, or finding the perfect words to express themselves. Another problem was the perennial problem of originality. Almost everyone was either trying to be original, for example, let me write a poem about electricity, because that hasn't been done before, or it just stated the outdatedness problem. According to Eliot, the solution to being truly original is ironically to go back to the past, yet not to imitate, but instead to steal and distort what has been said into something new, reflecting contemporary reality. Forms have to be broken and remade. The persistence of literary creativeness in a people, accordingly, consists in the maintenance of an unconscious balance between the tradition and the larger sense, the collective personality, so to speak, realized in the literature of the past, and the originality of the living generation. In a perfect sonnet, what you admire is not so much the author's skill in adapting himself to the pattern as the skill and power with which he makes the pattern comply with which he has to say. Eliot's vehicles to make it new were 1. Using the common idiom of his time, and 2. The rhythms of his time. I'll return to rhythms later in this video, but I'll share some quotes in passing on screen now. Back to our lines. Some of you may be familiar with the story of Actaeon and Diana. Actaeon was hunting with his dog when he spies Diana bathing in a spring. Actaeon becomes a peeping Tom, infuriating Diana, who turns him into a boar. This transformation is Actaeon killed by his own hunting dogs when they find him. The story served as a kind of warning. Lasciviousness is punished. Chastity, Diana was a goddess of chastity, is preserved. Degradation being a consistent theme in the wasteland. Who are our modern Actaeon and Diana? Actaeon is Sweeney, and Miss Porter is Diana. Now Sweeney is a character from two other Eliot poems, Sweeney Erect and Sweeney Among the Nightingales. He's a bit like a modern satyr figure. Miss Porter might be a prostitute or host from Sweeney Among the Nightingales, or from a goddess of chastity. The name Porter might be a pun and irony on port, the haven which a boat or ship docks in water. Finally, to help put this into further context, we have the words motors and spring. Spring is a time of reproduction in nature, but Sweeney's action is put into question by the word motors. Like the machine, he's only mechanistically going through the motions. Sweeney specifically, the motions of love, or he's only satisfying an urge, but there's no love proper. This mechanistic look at love reminds me of the scene from The Day of the Locust by Nathaniel West, a modernist writer who was influenced by The Wasteland, at least in his two best works. Love is like a vending machine, eh? Not bad. You insert a coin and press home the lever. There's some mechanical activity inside the bowels of the device. You receive a small sweet, frown at yourself in the dirty mirror, adjust your hat, take a firm grip on your umbrella and walk away, trying to look as though nothing had happened. Also remember that the satyr, like the nymph, is a fertility spirit. They're also both forest spirits, except again, the nymph is associated with water, while the satyr with heat. I posit Sweeney is a satyr figure, so if the nymph represents the softer side, and the satyr the coarser side, with the nymph's departures, the satyr or Sweeney types run amok. There might also be another detail that the nymphs are associated with the Thames, the river, to be contrasted with Sweeney with the motors, or heat. But it's an incomplete picture without the nymphs. The "Oh, the moon shone bright" is a reference to another song, supposedly called Red Wing. The best copies of The Wasteland will explain how Eliot is probably lying about the source and/or explain just how vulgar the song is with its original lyrics. Depending on which copy you have, it will either state that the feat at line 201 is a euphemism for something else in the original, or that in the original, it spares the euphemism and states it directly. The feet washing is another Parsifal reference, Wagner's, not von Eschenbach's. In Wagner's opera, Kundry washes Parsifal's feet before he heals Anfortas, the opera's wounded Fisher King. Parsifal will use the Spear of Destiny to heal him, the same spear that Anfortas was wounded with. For some background, Anfortas was injured by the spear because he allowed himself to be seduced by Klingsor's flower maidens before one of them injures him and steals it for Klingsor. Relevant for our purposes in this section is that Anfortas was punished for his lust and later healed. Parsifal checked his lust, and this check was celebrated. As for the soda water, like the snow in section 1 and the perfume in section 2, it's another poor water substitute, except soda water has some modern connotations that snow doesn't. For example, I have in mind, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but modern diet and modern digestive health, just how common it is for us to drink soda water for upset stomachs. And the French line here translates to, and oh those treble voices, singing in the dome. This translation is from the Signet edition of The Wasteland. It's from the sonnet Parsifal by Verlaine, the final line in fact. Here is some of the poem as quoted in the annotated Wasteland. Parsifal has overcome the maidens, their pretty babble and alluring lust, and the downward slope toward the flesh of the virgin youth who tempts him, to love their swelling breasts and pretty babble, with the lance which pierced the Saviour's side. He has healed the king, he himself a king, and a priest of the most holy treasure. In a robe of gold he worships the vase, glory and symbol, where the actual blood shine, and oh the voice of those children, singing under the cupola. The last line is a reference to Wagner's opera. After Anfortas is healed by Parsifal, the choir of children sing. Putting lines 196 to 202 together, Sweeney, or a satyr type, goes to a woman of questionable repute. They engage in intercourse, hence the spring. The lyric at 199 gives us the context that maybe Miss Porter and her daughter are washing something else in preparation for their dates. And the last line at 202 is terribly ironic, since their exchanges aren't a triumph over temptation, nor will lead to children, nor are meant to. Lines 203 to 206. Twit, 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 jug, 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 so rudely forced. Terrier. These lines harken back to Philomela and Tereus in section 2. There, I gave my opinion on how it can be a little ambivalent, how positively or negatively you can interpret Philomela's song, though probably negatively was the safest way to go. Here I think these lines give us the final say. In that section, the presence of rats is our only indication of a reproduction, of life carrying on, and Philomela the only sign of a birth. But these lines are all negative. Remember, jug is a sexual euphemism, and twit is a synonym for slut. The rudely forced needs no explanation, and terrier is short for Tereus, so Philomela singing the name of her vicious attacker. Yet in the Wasteland, people with their dirty ears hear the song and think of something vulgar, are oblivious to the nightingale crying out her attacker's name, or even think that the song is beautiful when verbally it's not. Lines 207 to 214. Unreal city, under the brown fog of a winter noon, Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, unshaven, with a pocket full of currants, CIF London documents at sight, asked me in demotic French to luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. Unreal is a motif in the poem. In its first appearance, it described these dead souls commuting to work. Also there it was a winter dawn. Now it's noon, so there's seemingly a progression. We'll discover in section 5 why it's not. This scene also presents us with another display of Eliot's irony. First, we have the name Eugenides, which when we look at its roots means good genes. The Smyrna merchant should remind us of the Syrian merchants from Commercial Romance, which according to Weston had a hand in commercial expansion and diffusing the fertility cults, or at least certain practices of them, to other lands. But there is little doubt that separately or in conjunction, both cults traveled to the furthest borders of the Roman Empire. The medium of transmission is very fully discussed by Quimont in both of the works referenced to. The channel appears to have been threefold. First, commercial, through the medium of Syrian merchants. As ardently religious as practically businesslike, the Syrians introduced their native deities wherever they penetrated, founding their chapels at the same time as their counting houses. In Eliot's time, the commercial element is still there, except now it's with the Smyrnas, so up to date. Also, the merchant is connected to the sea, hence water, hence health. He's probably young and financially successful, so it should all bode well, yet his French is vulgar. So he's probably able to participate in reproduction, given his name, and this is central to the ancient fertility rituals. Going back to my first video, I explained the lance and cup and their individual importance and rituals. The lance corresponds to the male reproductive energies, and the cup to female reproductive energies. For their respective rituals, the lance rituals were more public, and the cup ones more secretive. They were both fertility cults, but the cup cult was more cultish, if that's a word. Our clue that Eliot does want us to have the fertility rites in mind is the word luncheon, which should remind us of the mystic meal of From Ritual Romance, covered in my first video. But also at lines 213 to 214, we discovered what this background has been leading up to. In Eliot's time, the Cannon Street Hotel reportedly had a reputation as a place for homosexual liaisons, and the Metropole was also supposedly the ugliest building in Brighton. Thus, Eugenides is engaging in actions that are love mechanistically, yet inherently infertile. This is the irony on his name. Also, in the early 20th century, homosexuality was much more secretive. It wasn't a cult, but it was secretive, like a cult. So there's been a reversal in the lance operating secretly. And what was once a life cult is now a cult dedicated in Eliot's view to infertility or sterile love. Before moving on to the next lines, we have to be careful on how to interpret Eliot's criticism. It's not a criticism of homosexuality as such. To paraphrase another scholar, there's Eliot the concerned moralist, and then Eliot the ironical observer, and here it's a case of the latter. Mr. Eugenides' actions are one part of and emblematic of a larger and largely ugly heterosexual picture, ancient fertility rites and their symbols in the modern world. I believe Eliot's more concerned in the irony and the direct consequences of sterility than any perceived immorality of homosexuality. As we'll see in the next lines, Mr. Eugenides' weekend at the Metropole isn't the nadir of the poem.